All right. I think we're all set for the first PetroNerds podcast of January 2022. I am honored to be back here today. This is episode 35 of the PetroNerds podcast. We've had some change ups, some different hosting and things. So I apologize to all the listeners for the lag in getting this out to you. The last podcast we had was with Dan Pickering, but I'm honored today to have Mark Rossano back to speak with me. There really isn't a better person to talk with about. I mean, it's January, the first podcast of the year. It is episode 35. And I was going to basically just sit here and talk to myself and thought, this is not going to work. People would rather have me having a conversation with someone. And there's so many gazillion issues to talk about. And Mark's probably the only person I think can go toe to toe with me on all these issues and bring something to the table and push back. And I think he's willing to interrupt me as well. So that's good. Without further ado, hey, Mark, how are you?
Good, good. Thanks for having me on. I'm happy to be the first of 2022. Hopefully, ushering in a better year than what we had last year. So it's a good way to kick things off.
It is. And you're actually the first of a very star-studded lineup. I have some great speakers lined up. I have Tatiana Matrova coming on to talk about Russia and Ukraine, and then I'll be actually talking with Steve Koonin on his book Unsettled, which I think will be awesome. So you're the first of many, but because of all that, we have a lot of topics to cover today, and we're going to bucket this into three chunks, and I'm sure we'll go on some tangents and diverge. Mark has a hard stop at the top of the hour, so we'll keep this under an hour. But the three buckets are really, I mean, today we're expecting inflation data to come in at any moment. So obviously you're seeing market swings, and we've got the Fed, which is hilarious because folks said that they weren't going to raise rates at all this year, and now Goldman's calling for four rate hikes. So we have this sort of U.S. inflation, Fed. I think we can bucket into that in this topic, as well as oil prices and OPEC and where things are going there, and really that we have to talk about the rig count going up and where the frac spread count is as well. The second major topic is this energy crisis, and I really want to get into this because we've touched on this in previous podcasts. I've talked about it. Lots of folks are talking about it. But I have put this awesome slide deck together. And so my clients have seen it and folks have seen it. But if you're looking at what's going on in the UK energy crisis and actually in Europe, and you're following the European Central Bank, it's not good. It's actually really, really bad in terms of what prices are being paid, especially for utilities, especially in Germany, some of the highest utility prices in the world. So we're seeing all these problems within Europe. That's being exacerbated, obviously, with Russia putting troops on the border in Ukraine. Those negotiations do not seem to be going too well between the U.S. and Russia right now. And we also have the Europe actually a little bit pissed at the U.S. because they're concerned that if we do put sanctions on Russia, if they do invade Ukraine, then they'll suffer the consequences of high prices. I'm not sure how we square this circle, because that's going to be a problem no matter what we do. And lastly, to talk about is China. There have been, if you've just kind of followed this podcast and you followed the end of the year and the beginning of the year with China, the property sector issues have not went away. The Evergrande issue was not exactly ring fenced. And there are a lot of concerns from an economic growth standpoint, and a lot of GDP figures that haven't come out, but they've been revised to well below 4% for the fourth quarter of 2021. So those are the three main buckets that we'll get into. So without further ado, we'll go through the US and stuff quickly so we can get into the really meat of this stuff going on abroad. And obviously, we should probably touch on Kazakhstan, because it's got about 2 million barrels a day of crude oil production, and Russia's involved in there too. So is China. So that'll be exciting. So, Mark, U.S. inflation and Fed. And what do you think of Goldman coming out and all these guys who seem pretty muted last year, saying, "Oh, now we're going to have four rate hikes this year"?
Well, the problem with their estimates for inflation is that they've constantly been wrong, which is why when you look at the city inflation surprise index, it went to the moon because everything kept coming in way above expectations. They kept getting pulled higher. So now they're sitting there and looking at what has happened. And when you look at the amount of money and liquidity that sits in the market, like RRP came out right around 1.6 trillion again. So you're watching so much money just sitting there sloshing back and forth. And the thing that people I think forgot when you look at the different structures, and I've tried to be really clear on breaking them down, is the flexible versus sticky. So flexible inflation is what, is gasoline, is the things that are going to move day in and day out, that are going to fluctuate. But people ignore the sticky side, and the sticky is where you're starting to see Powell get concerned. You're starting to see the Fed get concerned, because that is not going away anytime soon. Because for some things that people don't appreciate when it comes to inflation is it costs money to change your prices. And it's always gonna fluctuate on how much it costs. So because you have to change your pricing, you have to change how the suppliers are going to be fed down, what is it going to do for your wages, what is it going to do for your distribution. So there's a lot that goes into changing prices, and you're really seeing that stick around. And and as the supply chain got better, everyone's like, oh well, supply chain's improving. It's like, but let's look at wages. Let's look at how real wages have completely underwhelmed in comparison to where inflation is. So as things on the supply chain get a bit better, we're going to see that get pushed into wages. When you break it out into its different quartiles, the poorest quartile has gotten wealthier. They've seen the biggest increase in hourly wages, but the top quartile, or the richest quartile, has actually gone down. So when you look at the way this is working out, yes, you have people who are on the poorer spectrum getting paid more, but it's not even keeping pace with where prices have gone. And that's rent, that's food, that's just general living costs. And some of those are not going to go down. They may stop going up. And this is what I've really kind of transitioned into. It's the rate of inflation. Everyone's looking at this and saying, well, the rate is going, like, inflation's going down. It's like, time out. It's like, inflation is not going down. The rate of change is slowing. And it may even go negative in January and February. But then we're going to get a reacceleration as we come into March and April. So you're not going to get deflation. You're going to get this stagflation into another inflationary push. And then I think you start to see stagflation bite hard.
Well, and that's the problem I have with and there's great comments on stagflation. I think that's what's really troubling for folks is that I don't think the market is baking that in. So when the market, people are overly concerned about what's the inflation number going to be and how's the Fed going to react. And I don't think and I did hear somebody mention it this morning on CNBC, but you don't hear hardly talked about all is the impact of inflation is basically a tax on everything and everyone.
Right.
It will impact earnings, right? So all these
Yes.
companies have to pay more for stuff. And yes, you can pass it along so much, but guess what? When everything's 7% more, the consumer's paying more, and the consumer then has less money, and the businesses have less money. So this eventually starts impacting on actual earnings. And I think that's a piece that people have not realized. And the other piece is that the simple side of that is that interest rates are going up. I think the Fed, unlike the European Central Bank, which I would like to talk about, because you mentioned this sticky the sticky side, and the ECB had a couple speeches that they came out with. If you go to their website, the European Central Bank had a couple speeches, one on energy, and an interview that they did. And I found it fascinating because they've really stuck. We've seen the Bank of England actually raise rates, which I thought was the International Monetary Fund had come out last month and warned them about inflation. The Bank of England, they didn't care why they have inflation. They raise rates because of inflation. And I think the Fed has come to those terms of, doesn't matter if it's energy, doesn't matter what it is, it's that inflation is here and it's real. And the problem is the Fed is realizing, and they realized this before, but I think Jerome Powell now has job security, so he's willing to be a hawk, which is just annoying because he should have done this before. But the fact that the Fed is, we have 3.9% unemployment. So we don't have full employment. We have record job quits. We still have massive job openings, and people are moving around jobs. So for the weird COVID labor market thing, whatever it is, you're basically at full employment. And so the Fed has to act because they know
Right.
they're going to have this inflation. That wage inflation, very, very real. People are, yes, they're making a little bit more money, but they're paying way, way more money at the grocery
Right.
store. And that all these things come together really drive me a little crazy, because it's interesting with the European Central Bank, they're not willing to increase rates. Like they have taken the opposite tact and saying, well, about half of our inflation is energy, and therefore we're not going to raise rates. Well, Europe is really hell bent on this energy transition as well. And so they need it to go well, and they need low rates for half of this for tech and for energy and energy, transition stuff to actually work. And so they're not, at least they're saying now that they're not going to raise rates because they think they can handle, they think the rate will of inflation will decrease next year, and it'll be in line with expectations. And I do think that the chunk, when you start breaking out, I was looking at by country, and you can look at Germany, and you can look at Lithuania, and you can look at all these various countries. And the problem is, while the European Central Bank says that it's energy, when you look at the bars of each country, it's not all the same. So it's not like, well, the rate of inflation was this high, and it was all energy for one country, and it was all transport or something for another. It changes by country. And I think that that's the reality in the US, is that, yes, energy is a huge component. Natural gas prices, electricity prices, all that is going up, but everything else, especially food, is a huge component of that as well. And housing prices, I think it's over. I mean, I couldn't even believe it's the Schiller index. If you look on the Fred economic data, what it's over,
It's
the
19%.
average home price in America is over
Yep.
$400,000. I remember when people were shocked in Denver a couple of years ago when the average home price in Denver was over $400,000. Like, this is America. That is that's way outside of the realm for many and most people in the U.S. is to put 20% down on a house like that. So I think these one, the wage increases and the wage inflation is not as good as people think, because it doesn't benefit everyone. It gets passed along with inflation. And two, it's just these costs are, yes, inflation could stop tomorrow, but unless they come down, it's a whole different story.
Well, and that's the issue when you look at inflation, deflation, and then like when you bring up a great point on margin. So when you look at prices paid versus prices received, so prices paid is typically your leading indicator. It's what the company paid to bring in whatever the raw materials may be, whatever the inventory needs. But then the prices received is what you actually got for that. And there's always a lag. There's always that 2-3 months. So as prices paid continues to grind higher, and now it's actually started to flatline, there's still going to be some pass through, because it's going to go until the point where the consumer says no more. And you're starting to see that now. You're starting to see retail sales peter out. Like you were talking about real income. Like real income is down negative 1.6%. So you're actually seeing income now at a negative level, because you're not seeing the same type of pass through. Credit is jumping. Why? Because savings rates are back to October of 2019 levels. So that means that government transfers have stopped. You saw a big increase in payday loans, in cash advances, things that you see when people are starting to get stressed again, and you're seeing that debt increase because the people are struggling to maintain their everyday lives just based on underlying cost. Then when you look at the ECB and where they're about, I'm going to say, about 6 months behind us when you consider where we are in the inflation scale. And I'm speaking on the sticky side, not even going to touch energy for a moment. Just on the sticky side of things, they're about 6 months behind us. And the other thing that is kind of missed in this whole back and forth, when you're looking at what is happening with the ECB, the BOE raised rates. You had the South Korean central
Just for
bank also
listeners,
raised rates.
ECB is European Central Bank, BOE is Bank of England,
Yes.
for our energy listeners who may not
So,
be
and
familiar.
so then the South Korean central bank has now raised rates, and you're starting to see this rate move higher because people are starting to panic. You're starting to see people get a little bit concerned on where are things going, how are things going to continue to go forward, and what comes next. So what comes next when you're talking to the ECB, when you're looking at what's happening within Europe, they're going to slow down on their PEPP buying. So you're going to start to see some of the quantitative easing come down, but they're so fixated on the rate side. But rates, you set where you think the rate should be, and then you try to manage it. But the market is still going to set rates. And as long as you're no longer the biggest buyer, as we're seeing in the Fed, because I was having a conversation with someone today where, I said, I made a call at the beginning of the year in February of 2021 that we were going to get 4 rate hikes in 2022, and that inflation was going to go to the moon. And I was crazy. I was told, I also said that the 10-year is going to be over 2% by midterm elections. I still hold to that. And we've had these big moves. Like now, who doesn't know there's inflation? Who doesn't know that it's what is the next incremental move in rates? And the same can be said in Europe. Your largest buyer is stopping. and the Fed is stopping, the ECB is stopping. They're going to slow down these purchases, and I think in the US you're going to see it happen much faster because they're starting to panic. And then you might say, well, why, like now going into real estate? Well, what does that do to the 30-year their 30-year bond, which then drives the 30-year mortgage? What does that do to the down payments? And
We're
you
already s
need
and
to see.
we're already seeing the 30 years go up if you're
Right.
looking at those, and that's that all this is all this is coming together into this perfect storm. I think this is where earnings season, people have to really watch this, and we'll pivot and come back to energy in just a second, but people really have to watch this from a the earnings season is because yes, the Fed right now and the EC and the European Central Bank and all these entities and a lot of entities in the world are still putting money into the system, right? The Fed has made it pretty clear when then the Fed minutes came out last week, they're going to stop that rapidly. I mean, that's probably I wanted them to stop that, two times, their two meetings ago. I wanted them to say no, we're done with this tomorrow, but they want to ease the market into it. And it's interesting because every time Jerome Powell gets up and talks, he calms everyone and he sounds pretty dovish and he talks about full unemployment and he sounds that way, right? And the market goes higher and it's great. But then the Fed minutes come out and it's a completely different story. And that's what happened with this is he basically he sounded dovish, and I got some pushback on Twitter, and I thought, are you kidding me? He definitely sounded dovish. He calmed the markets, the market went up. That is dovish. Now the Fed minutes did not sound dovish, and they didn't they came out and basically said we're going to have there are real concerns about inflation, which means you should have stopped all the quantitative easing forever ago, and you can't be buying stuff anymore. And that means that the market is not going to have this big wash of cash that it did before. So that's going to probably start, I'm guessing is going to stop immediately as soon as they can. And then we're going to see, I agree. I think if 4 or 3, it doesn't really matter. We're going to have rate hikes immediately. I wonder if they're going to stop the asset purchases and then also have a rate hike and in the same breath.
I think they are, and one of the things that is missed, especially when you look at, because everyone talks about, oh well, quantitative easing, but it's like, what are they buying? And then you look at what they're buying, and they're buying obviously, their federal bonds, federal loans, but also mortgage-backed securities. And so you look at the housing prices, you look at where prices are, and it's like, guys, we really need to back housing. You really need to sit there and buy these mortgage-backed securities. Like, at what point do you look at this and say, wow,
And
we
they
really
haven't needed to
inflated
at all.
this? And
Yes.
that's where you look at where things are going and how. And so I actually think that you get a massive acceleration in the slowdown in purchasing of Fed bonds as well as MBS, and then you get your first rate hike that's going to come in March, and I think you get 3 in a quick succession. Then they'll do a pause, see where the market is, but they don't want to get in front of the market. That's always been their thing. They're very reactionary, and now the newest sentiment rating is 90% of people think that there's going to be 4 rate hikes, which essentially just paves the way for them to do 4. And the question is going to be how much. I don't think they'll ever do more than a quarter point because that'll scare people. But then when you look at what the ECB is doing, and you look at and I just to clarify what PEPP stands for, the Pandemic Emergency Purchase Program, they're going to slow that down in Q1 because I think they want to test the market. And the problem with what they're looking at right now is the consumer, and this is looking at PMIs or the producer manager index. When you look at what's happening there, you're seeing a huge drop off in services. And I know some people are going to want to point to Omicron and COVID. It's really not. It's an excuse that people use, and I get it. And I'm not saying that it doesn't show up in the numbers to some degree, but the impact in November and December of 2021 versus 2020 is vastly different. And so when you look at the services, the local consumer is struggling more and more in Europe. And then when you look at Germany, which is a very export centric nation, they send and they rely on China in a huge degree.
Mhm.
And China's not coming back. This is not something where it's like, oh well, it's 2022, the calendar turned. They're gonna stimulate. It's like,
Oh,
guys,
don't worry.
they they
We'll be
can't.
getting into the China.
Yeah. So when you look at where Germany is and where some of these guys now, they're going to get some benefit from the fact that some car manufacturing is picking back up, but you're almost at 30 weeks delivery delays on getting chips. That has not gotten any better, which I did say at the beginning of last year, and I was told that I was crazy to think that it was going to last until the end of 2022. I was told it was going to all be fixed by 2021. So I was right again. Just just
Well,
just
so
highlighting because I know people like to push back on the fact that I haven't been a raging bull on oil prices. But when you look at the economic backdrops and how this all plays out, I think that we're really starting to see the cracks in the underlying economy, which is going to be pressured on the fact that central banks are raising rates. You have fiscal and monetary drag that the economy is going to have to try to overcome, and it just won't be able to, which is going to lead to a much bigger slowdown versus expectations.
yeah, and I think there's a little. If you listen to my podcast with Dan Pickering that dropped last week, which is it is an hour and 20 minutes. It's really good because Dan pushes back on me, and he takes more of a counter approach of just saying it takes a long time for the shoe to drop. And I have been you and I are both perma bears on China, and I think it's hard because a lot of folks are. I sent Mark this podcast over the weekend called the Little Red Podcast, and there were two folks on it, which were great, that talk about we're talking about China, and they were the antithesis of one another. And I thought it was fascinating because if you ever find it, people who are bullish on China, they've written a book on it. They're based in China. Usually they're professor in China, so they have this bias. And then you have the people who actually it's Ann Stevenson Young. And she co-founder of J Capital Research. Her research is phenomenal. Her stories. She actually chuckles in the middle of her interview. She like is laughing because they're asking her anecdotal stories about stuff in China, and she's like, look, it's a joke. She's like, the whole thing's falling apart. And she gives all these stories, which I'll get into in a moment. But the point is that you have the people on, and this goes for the wider economy, the people that are pretty bullish that just think everything's going to be fine, and the people that think that we're going to work through all this, and the Fed will do things slowly, and people will get excited, and because they've seen the market respond, right? The Fed has done things slowly, the market's raging, and things are great. Valuations are out of control. And I think that's a reality, is that things do have to slow down. You just can't have all this money sloshing the system. And I think on, the more democratic side, especially from a political standpoint in the US, is people are pointing to, oh my gosh, look at the supply chain issues, look at Omicron, look at everything. This is actually when we need help. We don't need to be slowing down. And the reality is that just like the American people, and I think the country, are saying, one, they're not going to stand for another shutdown. And two, the economy can't actually handle the stimulus because they already have inflation, and we have these slowing effects. And I think that the slowing that's happening, there's a couple things on the supply chain side. China's linked to most of it. You mentioned the Germany stuff, and I always point out that inflation and high energy prices together are really important. And it's something that the European Central Bank has mentioned, but didn't do a very good job of saying, okay, together, these are really problematic. When we have high oil prices and high natural and gas prices, and we haven't had both together, we usually haven't had those high natural gas prices with it, and high inflation. All those together have a really hard are impact governments, impact industry, impact production, and impact the consumer. And for some place like Germany, when they're making stuff, when they're manufacturing stuff, and they're connected to China, they are hit really, really hard because they're feeling the inflation, they're feeling the supply chain impacts, and they're directly connected to Chinese economy. Also, what's fascinating is that Lithuania, who has opened, Lithuania had fun messing with the Chinese all of last year. They opened a Taiwanese office, and most people don't open a Taiwanese office. They open an office called Taipei, and they put the label on it called Taipei. And literally, this pissed off China so much because Lithuania, the small country in Europe, just puts a sign on the door that says Taiwanese representative office. And that stirred enough of a storm within China that they have actually banned they've impacted the sales, and it's impacted the supply chain because they're now having stuff stuck. Germany is not getting equipment and parts they need for stuff. If it's touching Lithuania, China's not basically doing business with them. So it's something I want to point out to people, that these supply chain things are really real, and China's stance on the politics and the geopolitics are really real. So when people say China is this benevolent, peaceful actor and they mean well and it's no big deal, this tiny little country, Lithuania, changes their door sign and puts Taiwan instead of Taipei, and you're feeling supply chain impacts now in Germany because of parts that touch Lithuania and Germany, and that it's a big deal because it bleeds into this bigger issue which is going on obviously within China. And I think this is we can segue to China and loop back to the energy crisis in Europe. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, so in Europe, when you look at what they're trying to do to solve some of the near term pressure, it's just throw money at the issue, which you're seeing
Yes.
them, essentially say, oh, well, the consumer is going to pay X, and then anything above that, we're going to pay Y. It's like, all right, well, how are you paying for that? Like, how much tax revenue is going to that? How much are you going to have to borrow to do that? So when you look at the stress that they're putting on the economy in the future to fix something that they created, let's be fair, and now they refuse to recognize that they created it, and there's clear ways to fix this. It won't be fixed overnight by any means. There's some easy ways to do it, where you have a moratorium on some of the carbon taxes. You incentivize some near-term burning of coal. There's ways that you can bridge this gap right now to get to the other side, but they're
I think you
unwilling to
might be
do it.
talking about a completely different European central bank or Europe when you're talking.
Right. Exactly.
They're
Because
all
they'll
in.
never do it.
They'll never do it. And there's two things. There was an interview with RTE that a member of the executive board of the ECB did, which is posted on European Central Bank website. And there's they call it, the speech is called "Looking Through Higher Energy Prices, Monetary Policy, and the Green Transition." And this is where they talk. What's fascinating is because Europe is in this crux of a massive energy price storm. I mean, we are seeing there's not a lot of the Energy Information Administration, we are extremely blessed in the US because it's extremely transparent. We have tons of data. We have weekly reports, and it's just awesome. All kinds of more information than you could ever need. You do not have that in the same in Europe. And so we're all looking at different price things. But basically, I mean, we have very high energy prices in Europe. They've come down. I mean, what is the terawatt? You're seeing them in, it's what, over $200 per terawatt hour. That's
Mhm.
come down. It's like $40. It was like $40 per MMBTU. That's come down because we have this, apparently the flotilla everyone is talking about, of these LNG tankers from the US, which are coming into Europe, which is apparently bringing down, just the idea of that is bringing down gas prices. But two things I want to point out by the European Central Bank is that they cite these high, when they're talking about inflation, they're talking, and they talk about their inflationary pressures, they have to cite gas prices directly, and they have to talk about the issue with Russia. And they say, I mean, they're in such a precarious position that they aren't getting gas from Russia right now. So we're not seeing, I mean, we've seen Russia really pull down on over the course of the year. They let the stocks draw down, and then they stopped letting gas come in, really reduce it to as low as possible levels as they can. They've got troops on the border of Ukraine, and we were seeing a pretty muted response out of Germany and other countries, I think, because they're very fearful, because if prices keep going up, they're really in trouble. And you're hearing on Wall Street Journal and Financial Times, you're hearing German utility providers going under. Well, this is a big deal because we've had 30 utility providers in the UK go under just since September. So you only had 49 to begin with. So, or actually, sorry, 41. So Ofgem, the UK energy regulator, Ofgem, OFGEM, Great Britain's independent energy regulator, as of June of 2021, you had 49 utility providers on their website. Now you have 30 that have went under, and you have over 25% of your UK electricity bill is, quote, for environmental/social obligation. So over 25% of your bill is an ESG tax, essentially. And if you actually look at the problem here, is that the UK, and I point this out specifically because they did put out a report, which is awesome. It's their government report, and they tell you how much energy, renewable capacity that they have, renewable capacity additions, and where all the energy is coming from in the quarter, and how it's changed quarter over quarter. And this, I haven't seen the same thing for Germany, but I'm assuming it's similar. The grids are different, which I'll get into in just a second. But what we see in the UK is that they had all-time highs for renewable capacity generation. Right, they added tons of wind, tons of solar, and lots of onshore wind, lots of offshore wind, etc. And that's what the Vertebral of the International Energy Agency and many entities within Europe are basically just saying. we need to double down on wind and solar. And the more wind and solar we have, the more capacity we have, we won't have these problems. And that's simply not true. And I point this out because we are facing this problem in Colorado where Excel wants to get rid of all coal by 2028. And basically our grid is largely renewable. And I think it's extremely problematic. So what happened was in the UK, offshore and onshore wind and hydroelectricity declined massively in the from if you're comparing Q3 2020 to Q3 2021, all three of those segments, hydro and wind and actually solar, all declined massively. Renewable power generation in the UK for Q3 2021 was at the lowest level since 2017. And that was because they didn't have enough sun, they didn't have enough rain, and they didn't have enough wind. So no matter how much generation they had, and it's really problematic because they went from, a day where they'd have 20% of their grid being wind down to 1%. And then they drew down hard on gas and they didn't have the gas. We've talked about this in previous podcasts. I've talked about it, but they didn't have the gas. And that goes all across Europe. And the problem is that's what we're seeing. That's really what we're seeing, I think, in Germany as well, is that, Germany has a 25% of their grid is coal and 25% of their grid is wind. And it puts you in a really precarious situation when you're not allowed to flex any of that. The UK is basically UK has a lot of natural gas in their grid. I think it's 37% natural gas for UK. But the problem is the wind is 25% of their grid. And this is massively increased over a very, very short period of time. So when if your grid is that much natural gas, that's great, but they don't have all the flexibility in here to where, so it feeds in this inflation piece. And these companies are actually going under because they haven't been able, there's no sort of backstop and the grid sort of didn't work here. And that's the situation we're all sort of going in as everyone doubles down on this wind and solar and doesn't have the adequate backup for these, for actually using hydrocarbons in the system.
Well, and you have to look at, you touch on where Britain is, especially when you talk about their storage and how they rely a lot on natural gas. But we also forget that back in was it 2017 where they closed one of their largest gas storage facilities because they didn't want to pay to upgrade it and to bring it up to spec. And in their view, they were already transitioning. We're not going to need this natural gas, so let's just let it close. And this became a very big thing because now you have what it was, I think at the time, the UK's largest gas storage site. And by shutting this, you just increase the volatility. So when you look at what is happening in the physical market, in theory, the Russian gas is available. It's just but Russia's not giving you a discount. They're like, well, you're just going to pay the going rate. And if you don't want to pay the going rate, well, go into storage. So eventually, at some point, they're going to have to sit there and be like, all right, guys, we have to go out there. And Putin's just sitting there licking his chops, just rubbing his hands saying, come on, guys,
But they
we're
are
ready when you are.
Russia is withholding gas, and they've made it clear that
It
they're going to
depends.
withhold gas.
It's not on the pipeline that is the biggest one going into Germany. The gas is available. It's just nobody's buying it. It is not like you can actually buy that gas at any given time, but it's at a rate that is massively higher. And
Right.
so you can either you risk and draw down gas storage, which they're doing, or you can start buying physical gas, and nobody's willing to do it.
Yeah, so it's all-time highs. I think the prices are what was it, over $200 a barrel. It's come down, but basically the equivalent would be $200 a barrel
Right.
For gas, and that's why we've seen that swapping. And this is where I really point out of this, and this conversation I had with Dan and others is that it's not decarbonizing. When you're moving this fast and you're putting renewables into your system, and then you have a slight hiccup and you have to go from nat gas to oil in your power generation, you're increasing your carbon emissions. You're not decreasing them. And this is a segue. We could talk about this for a long time, and I think the UK and German energy crisis is huge because if we do what the administration wants to do in the US, which is reduce our emissions by 50% by 2030, and then have the grid net zero, or the grid completely zero by 2035, that's huge. Our grid will basically, in a very, very rapid time period, be largely wind and solar. And I have many, 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 many problems with that, as I mentioned in previous podcasts, because almost all of that wind and almost all of that solar is coming from China. And the supply chain bottlenecks we've seen across the globe, just because of COVID in China, are huge. But if we didn't have the human rights issues within China, it would be one thing. It would still be problematic to be getting them, but we really do have these human rights issues. And I point out there's two things that if people haven't followed, is that, and I'm holding this up. Okay, this is the if you're not aware of human rights abuses and genocide in China, you don't have an excuse anymore because it's out there. And this is the UK Uyghur Tribunal, the actual judgment that came down. The basically it's not a legal binding panel by any means, but it's a group that came together within the UK. It's really an incredible document. They all the research that if you're familiar with it and you've read papers and you've read, there's a great paper called "In Broad Daylight," which is about the solar panel, solar panel supply chain in China and Uyghur abuses within that system, and how 45% of all solar panels being out of China are come from the Uyghur province of Xinjiang. But this report basically consolidates all this evidence and puts it together. It's extremely damning. And the reason it's really important is it brings it all the way to the top. So it links actually Xi Jinping and what's going on within Xinjiang, and a direct linkage saying basically he ordered this, which is case in point. I mean, we know that he's at the top of everything anyways, but the reality is this is a domestic policy agenda by China. And I think it sounds ridiculous, but I think it's really, really important for listeners and people to understand is that when we talk about Evergrande and we talk about the property sector and we talk about the serious economic issues within China, which are the list is long and it's a very long myriad of things going on with China. Their domestic policy agenda and the fact that they're doing this thing within Xinjiang and the genocide that's taking place, it's really crucial to think about. Nobody's putting in context of a broader geopolitical look back of what does this mean? What do they actually want for global governance changes? What do they want to do abroad? What do they actually see for how they see the world and what do they want to do? And I really also don't think people are thinking about it that when countries like this make choices like this, these are big statements that they're making that are way more important to them than the economy. I mean, they paid millions and millions for, or billions, if not trillions, for the surveillance and the security systems that they put in place just in this country. I think it's something like 8 cameras per one person within the province of Xinjiang, and all that surveillance technology, which is fascinating, has been exported to all these places around the world. But the point is that it is a domestic policy agenda. It is happening within China, and it does get to this point of what the hell is going on within China, and can you rely on their economy anymore? And I think the answer is clearly you can't. You probably couldn't have since the crackdowns, the regulatory crackdowns began in November 2020, which doesn't seem to be a coincidence exactly of the COVID outbreak. But I mean, now with this and all these supply chain things, and the fact that the U.S., if we implement not being able to buy things from the province of Xinjiang, and it really probably should be spread to other parts of China as well. But if just wind and solar alone are going to have massive, massive implications, given that, most of your third largest wind turbine manufacturer, Xinjiang Goldwind, is in Xinjiang. This is really problematic.
Well, and I think it's also important to look at, none of this happens in a straight line. And when you look at Xinjiang and what they've done with the region, they started a lot of the surveillance back in 2008. And it's, if you look at why do they get these areas, even though it's highly Muslim, it's they needed a buffer. If you look at what they've created, and there was always friction there, and they started with, well, we're doing this for your safety. And then it started with, we're doing this with your safety, we're putting up all of these different cameras, we're going to start building this out. And then when it got to 2013 and there were several terrorist attacks from the locals against the Chinese, they then used that as a means of just expanding their capacity. So they started building essentially monitoring posts every so many miles in increments to make sure that there was enough assets there. And then if you became a person of interest, they openly said, we are going to put a tracker on your vehicle. And that really accelerated in 2013, and then you saw where it continued to expand. So because some of the pushback is where when I talk about some of this, it's like, oh well, we're only finding out about this now, like this is just being made up. It's like, no, this isn't. This has a very basic kind of that gradual piece where it starts out slow, then it accelerates, then there's a flash point that they grab onto and run with it. And now you have what is currently transpiring in Kazakhstan, and what is happening in the other stands. These countries are being paid to look the other way, because you're seeing these Sunni Muslims getting just slaughtered, or being used in work camps, getting abused in so many different ways. And these are I mean, historically speaking, from when you look through generations and settlements, these are historical. Tajikistan, these are Kazakhstanians. So you're watching them, but they're being told, stay in your lane, stay over there, and we will inject billions into your country,
And
and
I'm
ignore what's happening over here.
I think that's those are all really valid points, and it's not an issue you can just pick up and understand quickly, right? It is
Right.
taking me. I spent the last year or two really looking at the Xinjiang issue, and in the beginning, I mean, Kazakhstan is relevant right now because obviously we had a supposedly this was a protest on high energy prices, and maybe that's real, maybe that's not, but it was an easy way for, okay, there's this protest on high energy prices, and then supposedly it just got hijacked by the crazies, and then they asked Putin to come in. Now Kazakhstan is important because it is on the border, and I think Xinjiang is really important to think of. Pull up a map and just look up the province of Xinjiang. It's Xin, Jiang.
And
So
G, yeah.
if you Google that, and then you look at Kazakhstan, you look at these regions, it's a border region. And so when you read Xi Jinping's texts that he actually has in his global governance books, the border regions are talked about. It's securitization of the border region. So it's about security. It's about, bringing in this whole national rejuvenation strategy and everything since Xi Jinping has been in. You're right that it started earlier in 2008, but it's been extended and really, really
Right.
been. And what this UK Uyghur Tribunal does is it's so damning on Xi Jinping, because a scholar, Adrian Zenz, goes back and links his actual direct speeches to what he gave within the province of Xinjiang to his broader speeches, and basically says this has been going on for a while. And so it's about controlling this border region. And clearly there's something going on with Russia and China, which is alarming now, because clearly there's coordination between Russia and China with what's going on within Kazakhstan. And
Well,
that border region does matter to them, because Kazakhs are also a population within Xinjiang that are being, I wouldn't say
right.
not so much as the Uyghurs, but are definitely being are being pushed aside.
But now some of the key pieces there is, I mean, it started before 2008, but that was really when it took center stage because of what was happening. And that was when it really became kind of pulled to the forefront. But one of the things that I always find interesting, when, yes, LPG pricing was kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back. But when you look at what the protesters were demanding, none of it was about prices. It was all about, and one of the nomenclatures that says, get the old man out. The old man out being Nazarbayev, who has been in power as a dictator since they became their own nation. And then he handpicked his successor, who is currently in control. So that was like, it wasn't something where, oh, well, propane prices are back down, so guys, it's time to go home, let's get back to business. It's no, there is a political reason why people are so angry in Kazakhstan and what is happening in that area. So when you look at what is happening between Russia and China, now this is where I diverge with others. Is I think that there's more fear than friendship between the two. And when you look at what is happening right now, Russia is rushing in under, using the CSTO treaty in order to come in aggressively. They're bringing in Russian soldiers, Belarus
Which is the
soldiers.
first time they've really acted on one of these treaties, by the way.
Yes, because this is a huge piece, because they don't want China involved. China claims about, I think it's 40,000 square miles in Kazakhstan as their own, under the same, because if you look at what China claims, and they use this when they were defending what's called the Nine Dash Line, when you look at what they've done, which was resoundingly defeated in 2014, saying that, no, you're actually taking people's homes,
Yeah,
and
but
you're
they don't
taking
care.
people's land.
They've never acknowledged that.
Right. So the thing is, China claims a large part of Siberia, essentially where Russia keeps all of their eastern naval assets, and a large part of Kazakhstan, which you'll be shocked to know that China claims a large part of oil and gas producing regions.
Shocking.
So when
Only
you
2 million
look
barrels a
at
day of production there. No big deal.
Right. So when you look at what they're doing, you have actual people, and I think it was their airborne unit that was moved off of the border of Ukraine and flown directly into Kazakhstan because it's so important to maintain the influence that they have. Now, that is also something that if you look back into Ukraine, that was what also happened. And that was why Ukraine became such a big issue. And that's coming back to the Budapest Memorandum. And you have these working pieces. And it's unfortunate that we're running out of time because this goes back to the collapse of the USSR and how this was all structured. So then when you look at China, China's chomping at the bit to get a significant more amount of these assets. And they're just biding their time because they're like, we can wait. There's, nobody is coming from Xinjiang to Beijing. Like you
Yep.
have hundreds of thousands of like the
Unless they're
most
on a
desolate
bus, of
areas
course, bus,
to
but yes.
right. So when you I read this great book, the Prisoners of Geography, and it just talks about how you have to cross an arid desert to get there. And so when you look at the bufferings that have been created and what has been done, like there's been a new build out, a renewed build out, I should say, rather, of Chinese and Indian assets. And the thing that is important to look at when you're talking Russia, China, India, US, Russia was the first country, and in a matter of hours, to back India after the Ladakh incident where Chinese soldiers attacked Indian soldiers. They accelerated the delivery of S-400 systems. There are Indian soldiers right now being trained within Russia how to use all of this equipment, and it's going to be used against China. So when you look at where this is, there is a very clear divide. And don't get me wrong, an enemy of my enemy is my friend,
Well,
but
yeah, and I
there
think I
is
just
a
want to put a little pause on that for a second because I know you have to jump off, and I'll probably round the circle with the listeners and explain a little bit more after you jump off. But I think we have to be a little bit careful because we've diverged way into geopolitics from this energy podcast. But the fact that China and Russia is not I mean, I think that your point, enemy of an enemy is my friend. I do think right now there's probably some coordination and collusion by the Russian and Chinese, and you have a overwhelming, I think, bias in DC that always says, well, they're not really good friends, so that always benefits us in when we're thinking about geopolitics as well. They're not really good friends, so they'll probably fight each other in the long run. Yeah, but if they both see vulnerability in the West, in the U.S. and Europe right now, and they think now is an opportune time, it just makes sense, right? So it makes sense to me that the Chinese would be worried about Kazakhstan. It makes sense to me that Russia would be worried about Kazakhstan, that they would both see as opportunistic to sort of be involved there. This is a border region to Xinjiang. The border region is already important to China. Part of China's national rejuvenation strategy, part of China's dream, part of everything Xi Jinping has talked about is about territory. And I think it's also just protecting that territory. And sometimes things look messy on a map and moves look messy that in reality, I mean, it's not perfect. But I do think this one's a relatively serious issue. But they may not like each other, but doesn't mean they're not working together.
Well, so this is where I go by actions, not what DC says. And so when you look at Putin is not a stupid individual. He has learned
No,
from
he's
the
not.
errors of the past. And they made an agreement with Germany, and Germany immediately turned around and marched on Russia. So now you have a country that is by every action going against China. They have 146 million people, and large parts of essentially anything east of Mongolia, north of Mongolia, they speak more Chinese than Russian. So there is a big fear. And let's be fair, if the US and China go to war, good luck getting a billion people, or just using large numbers into US territory to attack. Now, it doesn't take much to march on Russia because you share a very large land border. And there's a huge amount of concern, which when you look at what Russia did when they had their large Siberian war games, and they quote unquote invited several Chinese people to observe the actions of a multi-discipline war games encompassing 54,000 soldiers. This was not like, oh, look at what you can ally to. This is, look at what happens if you invade North. So there is a very big, and again, it's an agreement. I'm not saying that they're not going to try to take advantage of things, but there is an understanding, and the actions are very much, which is why it's funny, because India had their back. They first were supported by Russia, then they were supported by Japan, then they were supported by Australia. Now, what do we know about China? China was very quick to say something about what Japan did, and and the sanctions actually started against Australia after Australia backed India after Ladakh. China never said boo about Russia. And so that's when I look at this and I say, China right now needs Russia more than the other way around, but
Well,
that can
and that
change at any time.
right, and that's I also think they know where their leverage is, right? They don't have to. I mean, they have leverage over. They know where they can push on India, and they know where they can push on Russia, and they know it's like friend enemies. It works. I mean, they're closer together. It's the Japan and Australia are, more democratic countries that they have to deal with and oppose.
Right.
And we've seen that as well. So I know you have to run. You have a hard stop at the top of the hour. Don't worry, listeners. I'm going to keep going on with this conversation. But just to bring this back, gas right now, at least at the start of this podcast 40 minutes ago, was $4, $4.08. WTI was 78.20, and Brent was just over $80. Given all this volatility, I think we used to have a sort of there's a couple dollar premium that's baked into this. So all this Kazakhstan volatility, and Kazakhstan does produce about 2 million barrels per day of crude oil. At least they did in 2020. Is that what are you thinking on oil prices with all this geopolitical volatility, and given what is happening with the Fed and the fact they're going to raise rates, dollar is going to go up, and that should go against oil prices.
So right now they're producing about 1.7 million in black oil. They're back up to where they were. So Kazakhstan is kind of flattened out, and even during the a lot of this pushback in terms of what was happening with the protests, the three refiners that they have were operating the whole time. So there was minimal impact. Not to say that there can't be more, but anybody who tries to take over from Kazakhstan also understands that it's important to protect these assets. And a lot of them are also funded by the US, and they're not looking to piss off the US at this point. So when you look at that, and then you look at what's happening in Libya, you've had about 200,000 barrels return from Sahara. So you're starting to get some of that production come all the way back full circle. I think this is going to increase some of that fear, especially when you look at CPC or what comes through the Caspian Sea and some of the other areas, because a lot of the issues weren't at the actual facility, but a lot of the crude is actually trucked. And it was the roads that were no longer safe, and it was the actual drivers that were also went on strike. So that can spring up at any given time. But you want to look at the actual asset itself, because those things can be repaired quickly. I think the dollar continues to go higher. I think the dollar is going to drift. I was long the dollar below 90. I sold it above 96. I'm not looking to get back in the dollar yet, just because I think you just go sideways at this point as you have a
But
lot
does
of
that
conflicting
should
moves.
weigh that's a bit of a weight on oil, and I think
Yes.
that's where these whole JP Morgan, Goldman, everybody, Bank of America, pie in the sky, $125 oil. I'm not. I mean,
It,
yes, there's scenarios we can get there if traders really want to take it to above 100, they can. But I think the fundamentals are not.
right.
If I told people this previously, but if the market was as tight as everyone thought it was, all of 2021, we would have seen 100 then.
Well, and if you just look at differentials, so China has slowed down buying. ESPO and SOCOL, which were trading at $7 premiums, are now trading at $2 premiums. And that's between October and January. So you've seen a big slowdown. Now, I've talked about Angola. We know that China has not been buying from Angola or West Africa to the same level, but they were buying a lot of this Eastern Siberian oil. But now those prices have actually come down. So when you look at the slowdown, and they've actually cut the import quotas into China, and now that's a broad statement, because they actually favored several facilities, which are mega facilities coming online, essentially pushing some of the smaller teapots to either shut down or just cease operation, because they're not going to have flow. So when you look at what China's doing, and back to your point on the underlying market, I think that people are overestimating demand. And I know that everyone likes to talk about Omicron and COVID, but I think that there is a much bigger problem when you look at the consumer, when you look at inflation, how much that's biting into everyday things. And now you don't have government transfers in the same level. You don't have your savings sitting at the same level that they were at. You have savings rates falling. You have wages not keeping pace.
So you're in
And I
total
think that
agreement with me.
yeah, so I think that caps a lot of this upside, and then you add the pressure of raising rates because as the Fed goes away, well, how am I going to incentivize people to buy my bonds? Well, I'm going to have to offer a higher rate. So as rates go up, you're going to see the increased cost of borrowing, and then you're going to see the increased cost, and the weighted average cost of capital or the WACC, starts to go up again, and you start to see a little bit of a normal market, but you have a fiscal and monetary drag that is going to continue. Fiscally speaking, how many people bought everything that they needed to in 2020 and 2021 because they had all this free money from the government? So you went out and you bought the stove, the fridge, the extra car, you added an addition onto your home. How much of that is going to happen again? And that's where I keep coming back to: who's your incremental buyer? Who's your next buyer
You
going
know,
forward?
I actually thought, and I know you need to run, so you're just gonna tell me we're gonna give a stop in just a second. But I always thought that when I was looking at the economy, and it was 2020, and I didn't know what to think of the market in the beginning, but I thought, man, the summer's gonna come around because I didn't know how big that stimulus was gonna be. Obviously, that Biden was gonna win, and that you're gonna write just $1 trillion checks every 5 minutes. But I really thought that at some point the hot tubs are gonna come for sale. The dogs that no one can find at the pet places, you're going to have them rampant and running around the streets, and those campers and snowmobiles and everything are going to come for sale. I think we're closer to that point. I mean, actually think this summer and potentially this fall is actually when you start seeing hot tubs for sale and stuff for sale, because I do think when you make those comments about payday loans and things, I do think you're seeing the weakening consumer, and I think that weakening consumer was largely especially December and
Yeah,
in November, October through December was covered up because everybody was saying, I'm going to have a good Christmas, damn it, because I didn't have
right.
one last year. We're going to come hell or high water. We're going on vacation. We're spending the money. We're doing whatever we have to. And I just think people's budgets are going to be a little bit, especially on, the bottom half, bottom 50% of the US. I think the consumer is going to be, and I mean, I'm looking at it. We're all looking at inflation and saying I need to spend less. And I didn't get the stove and I want one, but I probably couldn't get one anyone with the supply chain bottleneck. So I'm just not going to get it.
And
And I
for
think that's where a lot of folks are sitting right now.
Yeah, and for listeners, how do you track this? So the two things that I look at when I'm looking to see how this is going to shift is obviously retail sales. That's first and foremost. What are retail sales doing? But also inventory, because when you look at inventory has been creeping higher and has actually been beating expectations, and it's a mixture of people not buying as much and it's the supply chain loosening up a bit. But it's that's why when you look at inventory to sales ratios, they're starting to improve a bit, and that's due to, as you said, like slowing sales a bit. People that are coming down and essentially sitting there and saying, well, I'm not going to get the new Samsung stove or LG stove because it's not going to be there, so I'm going to wait 6 months, and maybe it'll be there and the prices will come down. So there's a lot of this. But when you look at inventory, and I know we spoke on a negative basis when you're looking at the economy, inventory rebuild is also going to be a little bit of a buffer, but it's lumpy. And at the same time, are you going to lock in prices at these levels? Absolutely not. But as a company, you still want to have a certain amount of consistency. So you'll do some buying of inventory, in February because prices got a bit better. You got a deal, and then you'll do another in April. So you'll see some of this, which is a net positive to the economy. But again, it's going to be lumpy, and the consumer, which is over 70% of US GDP, is still going to be the game changer. And you're just not going to see them come back in the same way at all in 2022. And I think that's going to be your biggest drag, with some spurts of little strength as you get some rebuild of inventory, some investment on the corporate side that may have just try to avoid it, or now supply chain costs are coming down, so they have some free capex that they can invest in. So it's going to be a very interesting, to say the least, 2022.
I completely agree. I think it'll be great. Well, with that, I'm going to let you go, Mark. I'm going to wrap it
Thank
up
you.
for the listeners. So thank you very much.
I'll talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
All right. Okay. So I know Mark had to run, and I apologize that for the listeners. And I won't keep this too long, but we covered a number of different topics, and some of that a little bit disparate. So I want to kind of circle this back and bring this back to a coherent conclusion, because we said we'd talk about U.S. inflation, the Fed. I think we talked about that at length. Along with Mark, I really do think there's a lot of softening that we're going to see potentially in the U.S. economy and globally, mainly because of these. Because we have real inflation, and because we're going to have higher interest rates, which is something that's normal, right? We're going to be able to, invest savings and things, and offset things a little bit. So that's going to be positive. However, this inflation is impacting the consumer. This inflation is impacting businesses, and we should see some softer growth. And that does mean that, especially with higher energy prices, that you may not see that crazy demand that we've seen, crazy demand growth in oil and natural gas consumption, which means that you could see some softening in prices. And I don't mean softening as cratering. I just mean that we're probably not going to see those, that we may not see those pie in the sky levels. And China is a big component of that, because the slowdown in China will impact the slowdown in Asia and other places. And just because you don't have a consensus, especially a market consensus, on the slowdown in China, does not mean that it's not real. And I think, I'm much more open about really, being, I would say, I'm more open about talking about China in a negative place economically. And I know these perma bears haven't been right for years, but I think it's really coming home to roost, because the data does keep coming out in different forms, and there's only so much that China can cover up. And I think that you're seeing more and more industry analysts and pundits and folks and people, because of the regulatory crackdowns that have taken place within China since November 2020, it has really gotten people fearful about the environment in which they can invest. And so there's only sort of a handful of folks left, like Charlie Munger, Tesla being one of them. Tesla just opened up a showroom within Xinjiang, which is very controversial. And we saw Charlie Munger is doubling down on Alibaba. And he's also been that makes sense, because he's been very pro-China, and he's been, ripping on Jack Ma, been very pro-Chinese government. So the folks who are heavily invested within China are sort of still kissing ass to the Chinese government. And I think you're going to continue to see that. But I think the reality is, and the underlying underpinnings of what is growing the Chinese economy, which has been the property sector, which is over 30% of the property sector, is falling apart. And even if it just flatlined and slowed, it would pull down and drag on the Chinese economy, which is going to drag on the Asian and potentially the global economy. And there are other pundits and analysts who say that, well, it's decoupled, and so we won't see that so much. And I don't think that's necessarily correct. I think a lot of these things that we're seeing within China from a supply chain standpoint, we are starting to see some decoupling. We are starting to see more and more pieces of the supply chain get outsourced to other area, Vietnam and India and other parts of Asia, but it's not fully decoupled. And we still have so much being produced within China. So as long as we have this secrecy in China, as long as we have a zero COVID case strategy, as long as we have volatility, as long as we have regulatory crackdowns, we're going to see problems within the system. And we don't quite have clarity on that right now. And, I really emphasize, and I didn't do this great when I was speaking with Mark, but the reason I really emphasize the issues within Xinjiang is that if you are looking from a supply chain standpoint, if you're focusing on the supply chain issues globally, if you're looking at the economy, you would have probably come across the stuff in Xinjiang from a human rights issue, just from an issue of whatever's being made there is probably going to be impacted in the US. Furthermore, it's probably going to impact eventually globally, because these human rights issues, these abuses, and these documented, now this UK Uyghur Tribunal, this documenting genocide, it's very, very serious. And it means that all this stuff made within the province of Xinjiang, which is a lot of textiles, which is, you do have this Tesla showroom, which was just opened. And we just had an email, we just had a article that got posted on Wall Street Journal about it, quote, Intel erases reference to China's Xinjiang after social media backlash. And this is a really big issue, because basically Intel had commented about chip manufacturing, and Intel had a note and commenting about Xinjiang, and they pulled, after social media backlash within China, they pulled that off. They actually pulled the word Xinjiang out of it. And so there's issues within China that companies themselves are not able to basically talk to the West and say, hey, we're not making stuff in Xinjiang, without having fear of reprisal within China. That's a huge issue. And that all social media is controlled within China. Nothing happens within China that news and social media does not happen the way it happens in the US, right? Information can leak out, stuff can get out there, and even if it's taken down, people are still aware of it and it pops back up again. That doesn't happen as much in China. And we see this within, you have to think about it in the context of this, is that if Intel faced backlash from just talking about Xinjiang and pulling that, that's a really big deal. There's a reason why. If you're not familiar with the human rights abuses in Xinjiang, there's a reason why, and that's because China has controls most. China controls the state media within China, but China controls a lot of media outside of China, and does a really good job of influencing media, influencing between surveillance technology and data and actual just news and the propaganda machine. They have a heavy influence and heavy hand in media abroad, especially within Europe, and increasingly actually in Western media stations. So I think it's really, really important to think about that. But from a supply chain standpoint alone, it's huge because it means that China's pushing back. I think there's been several articles on the immediate pushback when last month the bill was passed on Xinjiang and labor within U.S. Congress. When that was passed, there was immediate responses within China from the solar industry within China to push back on that, and that is because the vast amount of Chinese solar panels and Chinese polysilicon is made within Xinjiang, and it's a really important to point out. If you go on Carbon Tracker and you actually look at where the solar panels are or where coal power generation is done, so where the coal mines are at, and actually the coal-fired power generation. So if you look at that, you can see that there's a huge chunk that's concentrated of Chinese coal mines that's actually concentrated within the province of Xinjiang. And actually, it's not Carbon Tracker. Sorry, it is Global Energy Monitor. So Global Energy Monitor is a great resource in terms of seeing where these the coal mines as well as the coal-fired power plants and the list of them. And you can see how many coal-fired power plants China is adding. So when people talk about this and they say, well, the U.S. could not add, we could get rid of all our coal-fired power plants, but China's adding all these. That's a very, very real statement. China is adding coal-fired power generation and actually coal mines. So they have 479 coal mines in operate, or 479 coal mines total. 342 coal mines are in operation in China. 137 are proposed. And they have an absolute ton of coal-fired power plants. You can see, again, on Global Energy Monitor, a concentration of operating coal-fired power plants, many of which are actually in construction. But the point is that Xinjiang is rich in both coal for natural resources and having the coal mines. And then there's a huge chunk of coal-fired power generation. And it makes sense because China has increasingly over the years tried to move as much coal-fired power generation outside of the major cities to reduce smog and pollution and put them in other industrial centers. Xinjiang is definitely an industrial center. It's where stuff is made. And this is where these human rights allegations on which are no longer allegations, but on forced labor and internment camps and forced assimilation. The reason it's so big is because they make so much stuff there. So the reality is that a lot of it is probably made windmills and solar panels and textiles and t-shirts and jackets and everything are probably made from forced labor. And just for a power geek perspective, if you're actually looking at power numbers and coal plants from a megawatt, that's capital MW perspective, for the province of Xinjiang. So for all of China, basically operating, you have over 1 million megawatts. And for the province of Xinjiang, it's over 60,000. And then you have a significant amount that are actually permitted and in construction as well. Okay, so just that's to wrap up on China, Xinjiang and everything going on within, and actually the former police head of Xinjiang, so one of the bigwigs that was in Xinjiang, it was just announced by the CCCP, Communist Party, that he will actually be being moved to Hong Kong. That should be alarming for a lot of folks because it means that one, it looks relatively public that they're moving him because they're making the statement, and it also means that the crackdown, and it's already, Hong Kong's gone basically from the national security law and everything that's happened within Hong Kong and the recent elections, which didn't allow any pro-democracy people in it. There was actually just a third and one of the last pro-democracy newspapers was just removed. Apple Daily was one of the big ones. But now the former head of the Xinjiang province, one of the big police state guys, is now going to be in Hong Kong. So that's an interesting something to watch and keep an eye on. This is a huge, huge problem. And as much as China talks about it not being an issue and this being fabricated, this problem is not going to go away. And this is going to continue to come to light over the course of 2022. And I do think it's going to have a significant impact on supply chains and costs and have ripple effects globally. Separate from Xinjiang, the property sector problem is it's not that it's not just going away. There is sort of no end in sight also for this property sector issue. And I think for folks who keep saying that, Evergrande was not China's Lehman Brothers moment, I always say it doesn't matter whether it's their Lehman Brothers moment or not. There's so many other property developers. There are hundreds and hundreds of these property developers. And Evergrande, the couple things that have come out is Kaisa has missed bond payments. Lots of smaller entities, smaller companies have been basically asked for early payments for the offshore bond payments. Essentially, in the course of 2022, you will have over nearly $1 trillion in offshore bond payments due. The reality is most of those are not going to get paid. And then supposedly, according to rating agencies and probably rating agencies within China, is that the onshore stuff looks fine, right? Onshore bondholders are just fine. And I would question that because the data is not really reliable. And I mean, I mentioned this with Mark. There's a great, the Little Red podcast has a great episode called Shake Up or Shake Down. And it's talking about China's new red economy. And I think that this woman who talks about, there's two folks that talk about it. The first guy on the podcast, I think, is, he's completely bought into this very pro-China rhetoric and saying that it's going to be just fine and believes that's a sort of ring fencing. I don't know how you can go into the Bloomberg Terminal or Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and just type in China property. And the charts that you're going to see, the data that you're going to see is extremely alarming. And what you see are, I think a January 9th article from Bloomberg says China moves to give state firms more power, Evergrande update. So you have Shimo, you have tons of these companies that people thought were secure, right? That they thought they were the good property developers, and they've defaulted on payments or they're having issues. And the real issue with this is that because property probably makes up over 30% of the Chinese economy, it means that there are a lot of jobs at stake here. So there are folks that have not been working. I think it's a reason why China has, kept their part of the reason they've kept their zero COVID case strategy is because their economy is in turmoil, because it is slipping, and they don't want people to know about it, and they don't want people to see it. So you keep people out, you keep people from coming in, you keep people from coming out, and they don't see it. Evergrande was ordered to actually destroy several of their half-built buildings in a certain area that had people nervous. So the fact that you have tons of unfinished buildings within China, right? It's not, people talk about the ghost towns you see. They talk about when you think about the East Asian crisis and you think of Thailand and you think of all the empty all the empty buildings. There's lots of places in China where you have that. And the problem is that the property sector is just a huge component of the economy, and it's actually a store of wealth. And so people put a lot of their money into these property sectors. Some of on this podcast, the guy who was arguing on behalf of China and the pro side and saying that they were going to be just fine was saying that, they put actually a decent amount of money down on the down payment, so most of these properties are paid for. The problem with that is, and this woman points it out, and Stevenson Yang points it out, is that it's not a transparent system, right? So China can control the media, and they can make sure if property prices go down in one province, that basically the other province doesn't find out. They control the media, they control the narrative. So people can find out, they can do Weibo chat, they can do different things on chat forums, but it's quelled pretty quickly. And there's no incentive to really push back if you're going to get in trouble. So if China wants to clamp down on the people for protesting or getting mad, they will. And so I think the people don't have a ton of recourse here. And that's what's really problematic, because you're not going to hear, you would say, well, what about the social unrest? And what about the people? And people say, well, you don't really have social unrest. Of course you don't have social unrest within China, because the people know they're going to get in trouble. They could really have social unrest on their hands, and that the fact that they have a very high youth unemployment right now that's rising. They have a slowing economy. The property sector is, they're losing jobs left, right, and center. So if you're not developing, and so the people that are pro-China and the people that say they're going to ring fence this and make it work are saying that China will just stimulate their way through this, and they'll just keep this going. You can't keep building a property sector when no one's living in the houses. Like, eventually that's going to catch up and come home to roost. And it already is coming home to roost. But I don't think the answer is that they can just stimulate their way through this the way they have done in the past and just spend this money is really going to work. And the other point that this woman makes, which is great, is when I was talking to Mark, and she's laughing, and she's literally laughing within the podcast because she's remembering stories of when she would research firms and companies within China. And I think it's really important to point this out, because she talks about, she's an investment analyst, right? And she's looking at companies to look at and invest in. And she would go find the company within China and that's making X, is making something, and then would look at what they're actually doing. And the reality is what they were, they would say they're making this a certain amount of cash flow, and they would say they're posting this amount of earnings, and they make this widget. And she would go in there, and it would be a guy, on a single assembly line, and with a little one, actually a churning coal, and they'd be burning coal, a little pile of coal, and they're not making anything. So essentially, it's like a lot like the dot-com bubble, where these companies didn't actually exist. And I think this stuff is very, very rampant within China. And it's something that people have to realize, is that a lot of the people who are the bears on China, the ones like this woman, have real stories to back it up. There's a reason why she has a negative view on China. And a lot of that has to do with the corruption and the stuff that she's seen, and the fact that these companies don't really exist. And so when you're trying to paint a bullish story and a bullish narrative for how China gets out of this problem that they're in, you could be the US with the best institutions in the world and rule of law and the ability to protest, the ability, you could have all of this stuff, and you probably couldn't get out of the situation that China's in a good without getting your knee skin. So China's in trouble. The fact that the media and the market has not quite woke up to that is it doesn't really matter. They are backsliding, and they have some serious things, pains within the economy that they're going to have to deal with. And I don't think they're going to deal with it well, because they have a top-down system, and they don't have a market-based approach, and they don't have rule of law, and they don't have institutions. So I think we're going to look at a much slower path for China over the next several years, and that could really mean a lot more turmoil and a lot more actually geopolitical volatility, as we talked about with Kazakhstan, as we're looking at what I mentioned with Hong Kong, and potentially with Taiwan. All these are many issues that I don't think a lot of folks in the marketplace are baking in of real potential aggression. I'm not saying it's imminent, but the potential aggression from China, I think, is very, very serious. And I'm going to close this by, wrapping this up by talking about the U.S. and energy prices and Europe. And I think really watching the European story is very, very important. What the European Central Bank is doing, how they're talking about the fact that the European Central Bank talks so much about climate change, and the fact that they are talking about they have this speech which I referenced, and they're talking about essentially how to manage and deal with this and having these price spikes. This is something that the U.S. is not doing the same thing. So I've talked about investor pressure and where it comes from, and I do think a lot of it does starts in Europe, and it comes down the pipeline. The U.S. Federal Reserve has not taken on the task of climate change. I think they already have a very hard mandate. Just dealing with full maximum employment and price stability are huge. And the European Central Bank talks about making sure prices are stable as well, which they have not done. And so when they also add in dealing with climate change, the problem is it incentivizes them to want to keep interest rates low, right? And it wants them to, they have to keep interest rates low in order for this stuff to work. And the energy prices we're seeing within Germany, the fact that we're seeing utility providers go under, the fact that we're seeing so many utility providers go under in the UK, and the fact that weather is dictating, if you have an off quarter or an off month or anything, and you do have less hydropower, and you have less solar power, and you have less wind power, and you're not generating that electricity, it's really, really problematic without these offsets. And then so we're seeing these dramatic price spikes in natural gas. And the answer by the European Central Bank and the International Energy Agency is that, well, if we just had more of this other power, would be fine. And that's simply not the reality. And the UK is case in point, and they've shown it. You can have all the wind and solar and renewable power you want, but the only thing that increases in those time is biofuels, and bioenergy is actually they're burning wood. So the paying attention to European energy prices is huge. What the winter looks like, and what's going on the border of Ukraine with Russia, how the U.S. sanctions play. If the U.S. sanctions them, how this plays out within Europe. Europe is between a massive rock and a hard spot with Russia, and we're going to continue to see that over the next several weeks and months, especially during this winter. And lastly, we will see what the U.S. How the administration responds to the inflation number, which I don't have yet. Last month, before inflation numbers came out, the administration did the briefing room put out. You saw the U.S. administration actually talking about the Biden administration putting out charts, and they had this thing on their website on December 14, 2021, called, quote, progress at the pump. And they were talking about the small decrease by a few cents of oil prices and what that has meant for the decrease in gasoline prices. And so essentially they were bragging about the progress of the pump. And I think it's not a good tactic for the administration. I don't think it's going to work. Because even as Mark was saying, we were talking about in the podcast, even if the rate of inflation comes down, which it actually should, supply chain bottlenecks, lots of different things, if the rate of inflation comes down, there are many reasons to suggest that it might not, especially with supply chain constraints. But even if it comes down, it doesn't mean that we still don't have inflation, right? It means we could have stagflation, and prices are not going to necessarily decline, and that puts the administration and the Fed in a tough spot. And I think we're going to continue to see, as we have seen with these Fed minutes, of the Fed is going to have to be increasingly hawkish and work on inflation, because they know it has severe repercussions for the U.S. economy. And all of this, while I apologize for being long-winded, and I apologize for some of the listeners who may not think it impacts energy prices, trust me, in future podcasts, I'm going to continue to go into geopolitics and China and all these things and talk about them in greater depth and greater detail. It absolutely impacts energy prices. It absolutely impacts your business. And understanding that major issues within China and Russia could have reverberations through the global economy throughout the course of 22, I think is very, very serious. It could impact energy prices the upside, and that there's geopolitical risk premiums. But these slowdowns within China and these potential concerns within overall inflations globally, I think really do have capped sort of some upside to energy prices in terms of oil prices, and it means that these sort of pie in the sky, well over $100 a barrel, again, like what they say, they can happen. They may not be nearly as realistic. So with that, I'm going to close. Again, it is Monday, January 10th, 2022. This is the first of this year's recorded PetroNerds podcast. It was an honor to have Mark Rossano back on the podcast. I thank you guys so much for listening. Really appreciate it, and have a wonderful week, guys. Bye.